everyone, and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about Enigma syndrome. This video is going to be titled Everything You Need to Know About Enigma syndrome, and that is going to include care information, it's going to include tips and tricks, it's going to include what they're like when they eat, it's going to include what Enigma syndrome is, how your gecko gets it. It's going to include everything, so it's going to be a little bit longer, but I'm going to include timestamps down below. That way you can jump around the video if you just have one certain question or topic you want to check out. Before we get started, I ask that you subscribe and hit that notification bell. And now let's get started. So a few years ago, probably in like 2018, I posted a short series about Enigma syndrome called like Enigma syndrome series or something like that. And the first episode was about like what is Enigma syndrome, and then every episode after that I would talk about the severity of Enigma syndrome, how to feed enigmas, how to help them with shedding, that sort of thing. But I never like had one full video, and also those videos are very old, quality not so great, me, whole different person, so I wanted to redo them. So those videos are going to be all encompassed by this video. Before we get like right into it, I want to tell you guys a little bit about my experience with enigmas. That way you guys can know I'm not just talking about this from someone who doesn't have experience. So I welcomed home my first Enigma syndrome gecko in 2016, and I have been caring for enigmas ever since. I currently have 6 geckos with Enigma syndrome, and I had 8 up until late 2020 when my gecko Shireen passed away. She did have Enigma syndrome as well, and she died of a liver issue. I also want to go through and list all of my enigmas and put them on the screen just so you can see who they are, because I'm going to be talking about them throughout this video. And I'm also going to list the severity of their Enigma syndrome throughout the video. I'm also going to include Shireen in here, even though Shireen did pass away, because I think that for educational purposes, it is important to include her. Alright, let's go ahead and get started. The first gecko that I ever welcomed home with Enigma syndrome is Marcella, and she has a pretty slight syndrome. She is capable of living in a larger enclosure. She's capable of having substrate. It's only when she's overexcited do I see any of the symptoms. It has never been worsened with ovulation or stress or light or anything like that. So she is like the highest functioning enigma that I have. The next one that I got was Edard. Edard is my only male leopard gecko with Enigma syndrome. Edard has a pretty moderate case of Enigma syndrome. He does quite a bit of stargazing. He does quite a bit of like uneven movements, or like sometimes he'll fall over, but he's able to do quite a bit. He's able to shed all on his own, has never needed assistance, and he's able to have a bit more of a decorated enclosure, like he's able to do a bit of climbing, and so he's allowed to have a bit more than some of the other enigmas. Next up, I got Sam and Gilly, who are 2 sisters who have Enigma syndrome, and both of them I would list as severe Enigma syndrome. They both death roll. Gilly has had seizures. They've needed some assistance with sheds. They need assisted feeding every single time. They experience worsened symptoms when they're stressed or unhealthy, or if they have ovulation or like egg production. So I know that in these 2 clips of Sam and Gilly eating hornworms, they are very overreacting, right? Like they're super responsive to the stimuli of a hornworm. I'm also going to show them eating a superworm because they have a very different response. Now we'll talk about this a bit later in the video, like how their symptoms can change based on what stimuli is presented, right? Or how some geckos will respond by being very overly physical, like Sam and Gilly, or how they'll respond by being catatonic, which is something Melisandre and Roz do. But as you can see here, like they take a superworm much easier than they do a hornworm. It changes based on, how they're feeling, if they're ovulating, the type of insect. So just for like full transparency's sake, I wanted to show both clips so you could see how they act in both scenarios. The next enigma that I welcomed home was Melisandre. She actually started out as moderate, but has progressively gotten worse with each ovulation season. And so I would say while she was moderate at one point in time, now I will list her as severe. She is a lot like Sam and Gilly. She'll death roll, she'll flop over, she gets overstimulated very easily and needs assisted feeding. She normally sheds quite fine on her own. The next gecko that I welcomed home with Enigma syndrome was Shireen, and I would put Shireen in the same category of severity as Melisandre, Sam, and Gilly. However, she never had hers worsened with ovulation that I could tell, because she came to me as a retired breeder, And so I imagine at one point in time her Enigma syndrome wasn't that bad and that breeding made it worse for her. However, I did not breed her and she didn't really ovulate too much when she was with me, so she didn't have any worsening condition. But like I said, I would still list her as severe based on my other geckos. The last gecko with Enigma syndrome that I welcomed home is Roz, and I would put her in the severe category, but I wouldn't say that she's as bad as Sam, Gilly, and Melisandre. She probably would be somewhere like right after Eddard before them. I would say she's more severe though because she does ovulate every year, and as such her condition does get a bit worse. She's a lot like Shireen in the fact that every single time that she ovulates, she would lose color. They have a very similar body structure too, and they're both white and yellow crossed with Enigma. I would say Roz is not moderate, but she's also not as severe as the others, as I don't really see her death roll. Instead, what she does is when she's overstimulated, she just goes catatonic. I also think it's important to talk about the difference in severity because there's going to be a different display of symptoms in each gecko as well. So let's go ahead and talk about what it is and what it looks like. The Enigma morph first originated in 2006 as a random genetic mutation. It's a dominant gene and it results in sporadic small spots. Like a lot of other morphs, Enigma has been combined with like loads and loads of morphs at this point that you'll have, you know, Max Snow Enigma, you'll have Lemon Frost and Enigma, which is like, what? You'll have Enigma mixed with Tangerine, you'll have Enigma mixed with white and yellow. I mean, you'll have Enigma mixed with everything. One thing to know about Enigmas, if you're not familiar with them, is that it can be kind of hard to tell who is and who isn't an Enigma when looking at them. For someone who's experienced with leopard gecko breeding or genetics, it'll be a lot easier for them to say right away, just by looking at that gecko, that it is Enigma. However, you might not be able to notice, and in addition to that, they're also kind of complicated to tell for like a new person because Enigmas look so different from the next. As you saw, all my Enigmas all look quite different from each other with the exception of Sam and Gilly, who are sisters. So it can be kind of hard to tell. Enigmas often have really tiny sporadic spotting. It can be either just in one section or a couple sections or all over their body. They'll also have really light colored tails, so it can be like white or purple. They can sometimes also have that same like tail color of white or purple carried onto their body or their head, and it'll sometimes have little speckles in it. I mean, they can look like a lot of different things, but those are some traits to look for in Enigmas. The Enigma gene is also known to enhance the physical traits in other morphs. So for example, this is Roz, and she is a white and yellow mixed with Enigma. It just takes her white and yellow up a notch, if that makes sense. So like I said, Enigma syndrome is a neurological disorder that only Enigmas can carry. So like if your gecko has a neurological issue and it's not an Enigma, please do not say it's an Enigma. I cannot tell you, ever since posting my Enigma syndrome series, someone will send me a picture or a video of their gecko like having a bad hunting skill and they're like, it's an Enigma. Well, no. When you misclassify a gecko as an Enigma or like a gecko's symptom as Enigma syndrome, you're taking away from the issue. You know, there's plenty of other neurological problems. A gecko could be born with incubation fluctuation problems, bad genetics. It could have had brain damage. It could have had head trauma, you know. It could have metabolic bone disease, poor vision. All these things are going to impact like how it, you know, hunts and how it behaves, how it moves. And just don't say your gecko is an Enigma unless you know for sure. And a lot of times when you buy a gecko from a breeder, it'll say Enigma on it, or it'll have like a name like black hole. And then when you look up what genetics make up a black hole, Enigma is listed in there. You can always ask a breeder, is this an Enigma? Or like, can you show me some geckos that aren't Enigma? But a lot of times you're not going to find an Enigma in a pet store. You're not going to find an Enigma on Craigslist for rehoming without it being like a little bit more expensive or without someone saying that it's an Enigma. So please, for my sanity and for, you know, the proper education about the Enigma morph and Enigma syndrome, please don't just say if your gecko has like a weird quirk that it's an Enigma and it has Enigma syndrome. Please. Back to it. So Enigma syndrome is called Enigma syndrome because it is associated with the Enigma morph. So essentially, when an Enigma is paired with like, I don't know, a Tangerine, And then the offspring, any of the offspring that have the dominant Enigma gene and therefore they have the physical traits of an Enigma, they are going to have the capacity for the syndrome. Whereas if an Enigma and a Tangerine are paired and the offspring ends up being Tangerine and does not have the dominant Enigma gene, that gecko is not going to be able to have the Enigma syndrome. It is only passed on through the dominant Enigma gene, which, like I said, resulted from a mutation. So the only way that they're going to be able to get it is if they are an Enigma. There are a lot of symptoms of Enigma syndrome, and some of them are called by different names. I'm going to try and list all the ones I have personally experienced and also describe them. I'm also going to try find footage on my phone so that I can, put it on the screen for you here. But the symptoms are as follows. Head tilting, which is basically where your gecko will hold its head to the side, almost like, when you're talking to a dog and you say something in like a really happy voice and they turn their head all cute like. Well, an Enigma will do that. Another symptom is head bobbing, where they lift their head up and down and shake it as if like they're nodding, but it's a completely unnatural movement for a leopard gecko to do. Stargazing is where your gecko will like stare literally straight up at the ceiling and it'll keep its head there for a period of seconds or maybe even minutes, and it's completely unnatural for them to hold their neck at this angle and just stare at nothing. Another symptom is circling, and that is where the gecko will start to walk, and instead of walking in a straight line, they'll walk in a circle. This can be just happening once or twice, or they can circle repetitively over and over again for minutes. A lot of times geckos will like circle and then they'll walk normally and then they'll circle again, but some geckos only walk in a circle. Another symptom is having a wobbly or shaky or uneven gait. You'll basically just notice that the steps are very shaky, that they'll tremble a lot in their movements, or like instead of it being like an even movement, they'll dip more to one side than the other. There's just like a general wobbliness to their movements. Another symptom is death rolling. A lot of times when a gecko has a wobbly gait, they can end up falling over onto their backside, and then they do this like rapid movement to try and correct themselves to get back on their top side. And also something to keep in mind with Enigmas is that they can be overstimulated, and so when they're on their back like that, it's a lot of stimulation to their backside that they weren't expecting because they didn't realize they were flopping over. Another thing that can cause death rolling is, like I said, being overstimulated, but not from their own movements, but from your movements or insects, like you're trying to feed them, or bright lights, or if you handle them, they might start to death roll in your hand. Another symptom I don't see many people talk about, especially with like other geckos who have neurological issues, is self-mutilation, but it's basically where they accidentally hurt themselves while having a symptom. So for Sam, she bit herself in this clip not once but 3 times, which I slowed down so you could see, but it would also include like biting their tail or smacking their head and getting a scrape or something along those lines. And then the last symptom would be having seizures. So I've only experienced a seizure with an Enigma once, but it was not a great time. It was really scary, and it was after she had extreme stress from me trying to get stuck shut off of her toes when she first came home. That was Gilly. Like I mentioned earlier, there is a severity to the symptoms. So some geckos may have some of those symptoms, some geckos may have all of those symptoms, some geckos may show those symptoms only from time to time, some may show them all the time, some gecko symptoms could get worse with time. So really, it's just about being able to identify those symptoms in your gecko and the frequency at which they occur. Because like I said, it's different from gecko to gecko. So just make sure you have an understanding of your personal gecko. If the gecko is bred, if the gecko is kept in unclean environment, if the gecko has poor health, if the gecko is exposed to super bright lights or flashing lights, if the gecko is being handled, if the gecko is being handled too often, if the gecko escapes its enclosure or has some sort of outside enrichment from the enclosure, if your gecko's enclosure is too over-enriching, like anything that can cause stress can cause heightened symptoms, especially if it's prolonged. So like, for example, if they have a health issue and the health issue continues for weeks and weeks, their Enigma syndrome could get worse. So something to keep in mind is that the symptoms are going to change throughout their life. Something else to know about Enigma syndrome is that it cannot be cured. It's not something that like they can have a medication for to make it go away. It's not something that's healable or treatable. I mean, you can treat it at home by keeping stress low and by making sure that they are healthy and well fed, but there's nothing you can do to stop the syndrome from existing. You can only stop it from getting worse. I mean, to the best of your abilities anyway. What you can do to offer treatment to your Enigma is to offer a low stress environment. You want to offer the gecko a space where they feel secure. So a lot of times this will be a smaller than average leopard gecko enclosure. So I have my Enigmas in an 18 by 18 by 12, and it's a 15-gallon equivalent, but it gives them enough floor space to be able to, you know, move around, but not enough that they will get overexcited or lost or stressed out and then have symptoms emerge. It's also good to keep their environment quiet, so don't put them in a room where there's like a bunch of TVs or dogs or children. It's also good to keep them in a space that doesn't have a lot of bright lights or flashing lights. It's just good to keep their stress at an absolute minimum. And so, you know, reducing noise, reducing lights, reducing foot traffic throughout the room is just the best idea. You want to keep them nice and calm, you know, keep everything at a stable, constant, consistent level. One more thing I want to talk about when it comes to like treatment or healing of Enigma syndrome is euthanasia. This is a topic that gets brought up from time to time on my older Enigma syndrome videos. Like, it's cruel to keep them alive, why don't you just euthanize them? And I don't feel that they are in pain. I do not think that they are suffering. Like, it's definitely not a simple life for them, but I don't believe that they're suffering. I don't believe that they're in pain. And this is something that they've had their whole lives. Granted, if it got to the point where my geckos could no longer like move around, could no longer eat, could no longer shed, could no longer use the bathroom on their own, if it got to that point where they were always on their back and not like standing on their feet, you know, that point would be time for euthanasia. But my Enigmas, as they currently are, that's not necessary. Just because a gecko has to live a little bit of a different life, or an animal in general, just because they have to live a little bit of a different life doesn't mean that they have to be euthanized. But just trust that, like, I've had my Enigmas for years. If I felt like they were suffering, I would make the right call for them. That's kind of the part of like keeping pets online, is that you have to put a lot of trust in me and just expect that I'll be doing the best for them because I believe in doing the best for them. I want to talk about how Enigmas get Enigma syndrome. And like I said earlier when I was talking about their genetics, all Enigmas have the capacity to have Enigma syndrome. That some are born with it. Some, they show symptoms a few months into life. Some show symptoms after they have reached sexual maturity. Some of them show symptoms when they have been bred for the first time. Some of them show symptoms after years. There really is no safe way of knowing. And some people, I think, just miss out on like the slightest symptoms, like they don't see them, and so they don't realize that the symptoms are already there and the syndrome is already there. It just hasn't started to progress yet to the point where it's noticeable all the time. So as some people may say that this gecko does not have Enigma syndrome, and I have come across this on my Instagram DMs when they say, I bought this gecko, it didn't have ES, I watched your video, I see the symptoms. That's not really great. But I definitely think that it's a case where, like, unless you're paying really close attention to the gecko, you might be able to miss a symptom or two and therefore would think the gecko doesn't have a syndrome. But if you look at the respectable breeders in the community, a lot of them will not breed Enigma because so many Enigmas develop the syndrome. So it's just not a safe bet. While an Enigma may be born completely normal, they may develop the syndrome over time. They might have already had it and you just didn't notice. It is just likely, if you have an Enigma, that they will experience it at some point in their lives, and once they start to display the symptoms, they're never going to go away. Some breeders will say that they have Enigmas that don't have the syndrome and they've been able to breed it out of the lines. This is not true, and it's a really harmful narrative to spread about Enigmas when there are so many other gorgeous, beautiful, healthy morphs. I don't know why people have to fixate on one that is literally proven since 2006 to have issues. And like I said, there's tons of respectable breeders in the community who will not touch this morph because the evidence speaks for itself that there has been no single breeder who's been able to produce a line of Enigmas, you know, generations of Enigmas where there is no syndrome. Eventually it pops up, and when it does, that muddies the whole line. Like, that means the whole line carried it. And so it's just not something that is feasible. It's a complete misconception for a breeder to say that their whole line of Enigma does not have Enigma syndrome. I'll see some breeders who sell Enigmas and they're like, hey, possibility that it will have syndrome someday. And while that is more like responsible, I still think it's completely unethical to be breeding Enigmas in the first place. Now let's talk about how to care for a gecko with Enigma syndrome, because their care is going to differ a lot from an abled gecko's care. So first and foremost, like I mentioned earlier, you're going to want an enclosure that is not as enriching or stimulating as a normal leopard gecko enclosure. For me, what that looks like is a PVC enclosure that's front opening. I highly recommend front opening because trying to feed an Enigma with a top opening enclosure, headache. I don't recommend it. So I have a black PVC enclosure. It looks just like these, but it's half the size. So this is a 36 right here. The 18, 18, 12s are this space right here. So it's half the size of what I give my abled geckos. They still get cork. They'll still get a humid hide with a substrate in it this time of year for ovulation. Because who knows, I don't want my Enigmas to lay eggs, but if they decide to, I need to make sure they've got some substrate. So they'll have a dig box or a humid hide. They will have their cork, like I mentioned. They might have a little bit of driftwood or some hanging plants just to offer a little bit more of darkness. But in general, their enclosure is not going to be as like decorated as these. They're not going to have loose substrate on the bottom. They have kitchen cabinet liner instead. They look a bit cluttered to you, but the purpose of having a little bit of clutter in there is that when the gecko rolls over onto its back, it can immediately grab onto the cork because it's kind of in every direction. So if you have a really bare enclosure, the gecko might have an issue being able to flip back over if it ends up on its backside. And so being able to have that cork, which has a texture to it so it's easy for them to grab onto. It's lightweight, so it can't like fall on them or hurt them. If they smack their head against it, it's not going to cause them head trauma. Like, I just think cork is probably the safest option for them and allows them to engage with climbing in a safe way because it's like grippable, but also not too high and not too wobbly that they would just like fall off and get hurt. So it allows for a bit of enrichment, but also it has the purpose of making sure they can right themselves if they end up flopping over onto their back and death rolling. Another thing that I do is I don't have any lights in their enclosures. They have a day and night cycle from how bright the pet room is, and that is all I give them. I will not give them lights because I'm worried that it will worsen their symptoms, as bright lights or flashing lights especially are known to increase the symptoms in neurological geckos, or I mean geckos with neurological issues. Another thing that you're gonna have to do is provide really shallow water dishes. When you have an Enigma, if they're death rolling and they end up with their face in their water and they inhale some, that's really not great. So you want to provide a really shallow water dish that allows them to still drink, because I have seen my Enigmas drink. Or you can provide a humid hide with paper towel, and when you spray the inside of the humid hide, they can drink the water droplets off the paper towel and the sides of the humid hide. That's another way I've seen mine drink. But it is good to provide water to them, but just be certain that you don't provide too big of a water section or like too deep of a bowl, because that can be troublesome. Another thing you're going to want to do is hand feed them or tongue feed them. So basically they're going to need assisted feeding. Most Enigmas will need to tongue feed. Even my gecko Marcella, who has like the slightest Enigma syndrome, she gets overstimulated while hunting and can sometimes just like move the wrong direction, and so it's really good to be able to tongue feed her because she can get it right on the first try, because I've put it right where I know she's going to aim for. Don't be discouraged if you are trying to tongue feed your Enigma and it's not going well. It can take a little while for both you and your gecko to get the hang of hand feeding, because they're gonna start to learn like, oh, why are you shoving this worm in my face? It's so that I can help you. And you're gonna start to learn like some Enigmas will move a certain way and you can predict where they're gonna end up going, and then you'll know where to put the worm so they get it. Some of them prefer it to be like super close to their face. Some like it to be on the side of their face. It really just depends. And like I said, be patient and don't be hard on yourself. Once you and your gecko both get into the swing of things, tongue feeding an Enigma is not really much of a challenge. It can take a few minutes and they might get exhausted. Try again like an hour later. You know, just be patient, be persistent, and trust that you and your gecko are going to get this. If you have an Enigma that can hunt on their own, fantastic, but be prepared to tongue feed in the event that their symptoms get worse and they can no longer feed on their own, or if you have an insect that moves too fast and they can't catch it, just be prepared for tongue feeding because it's very likely that you will have to. You might also have to help your geckos shed their skin. In the beginning of keeping my Enigmas, I had a couple that had issues with shedding, and then once they were in my care for a while, they were able to shed all on their own. And at this point in time, I don't need to assist shed any of my geckos, including the Enigmas. So I think it's just a matter of like getting the humidity right, getting the humid hide to be like consistently moist so they can seek it out if they need to, and then also giving your gecko the right space in which they can like properly turn around and get all the shed off of themselves. The cork also helps with that because they can rub against the cork to help start to pull the shed off. Shedding is very stressful for Enigmas because it's an overstimulation, so they know they need to get the shed off. The shed touching their skin is an irritant, is a stimulant to them, and all that stress is causing them to overact. You'll see a heightened symptom response when they are shedding. Now, fortunately, as time goes on, I think it becomes easier because I don't really see those type of responses too often when they're shedding. They're able to shed relatively normally with a little bit of stress. Of course, like they're an Enigma, they're gonna have stress. If you notice that your gecko just gets really stressed out when they're shedding, let them do their thing. If they don't get everything, that's completely fine. Go in and assist them when they're done trying. You don't want to interfere with them because it's already stressful enough for them to have to remove the shed and to be feeling the shed on their body. So then when you introduce your hand as an additional stimuli, that can cause them to really go like death roll or catatonic, and that is a place you don't want them to be at. So you really just want to reduce the stress as much as possible, keep the room extra quiet, keep it dark. Once you see that they're done doing their thing, if you notice there's still shed, you can go ahead and help them then. I have a video that I'll include up here about how to help your gecko shed, and this would be any gecko, abled or disabled. But there is a section in it about how I helped my Enigmas shed, but basically I just, instead of putting them in water to like soften up the shed, which is too overstimulating for them, I found that out the hard way because Gilly had a seizure. The best thing to do is to take paper towel and fold it up and put it like in their humid hide or on top of their humid hide lid and just moisten it, right? Just enough that there's water sitting on the surface of the paper towel, but not enough that like your gecko can splash around in it, right? And then once that's there, you just set your gecko on top of it and like kind of contain them so they can't move around too much. Just do this for a few minutes at a time. Like I said, paper towel with a very thin layer of water on top of it. Like here's the paper towel and then here's the water. Like you can just see water on the surface, right? It'll be enough moisture to help moisten the feet shed, but it won't be so much that they feel extra stressed out and they have to death roll or go catatonic or have a seizure. So once their toe tips are nice and moist, then you can just peel the shed off like this. Now, if it's a gecko that you rescued and there's multiple layers of shed, you're in for it. You're in for it. If it's an Enigma and it has severe syndrome and it has stuck shed, I don't miss those days, okay? I do not miss those days. I had Gilly have a seizure from trying to get multiple layers of stuck shed off of her toes. Sam, we got the stuck shed off, all the stress that went along with it, and her toes still were dead underneath and fell off anyway. So it's very important if you have an Enigma to get their shed off as soon as they're done. Like don't leave it on for like a week, a month, because it'll start to dry, get crusty, get hard, and then another layer will be on top of it, and it can cause death to the like digit or the limb, wherever the shed is. It can cause infection. It's bad. So just make sure that you check your Enigmas, double check them. If your Enigma has stuck shed, remove it with the method I just suggested. If they have stuck shed on their eyes or like their tail tip or anywhere on their body, use a moistened Q-tip and gently go over the area. They will have a reaction to the stimuli. That's okay. That's just how it goes. The shed has to come off because it's going to cause more problems than, their very short stimuli response will. So just be very careful, okay? Blunt tweezers or your fingertips, do not use sharp objects near an Enigma. When they thrash, it's unexpected. You could stab them. Like, you really don't want any of that. So just be very careful. Another thing I want to talk about when it comes to caring for Enigmas is breeding season. Oh my god, it is the worst time to have Enigmas. If you have a lady Enigma and she ovulates or she produces eggs, I apologize to you. Like, it's a hard time. One thing I've noticed about my Enigmas is that they ovulate later in the season than my abled geckos, which I think is interesting. But Sam, Gilly, and Mel all start ovulating like at the same time my other geckos are finishing. So right now, exactly. You will notice their tails will shrink in size. You will notice they are like way more stressed than normal. You will notice sometimes they'll be catatonic. Sometimes they'll just have their eyes closed. They'll be heavy breathing. Sometimes they'll death roll. They will have a harder time hunting. They'll be more reactive to your movements. It's not a great time. Fortunately, when ovulation season passes, so too should the stress and the increased symptoms. However, this is not the case for Melisandre, who has decided, I guess, just to be completely afflicted by ovulating while being an Enigma. And I think it all stemmed from 2 years ago. She decided to produce eggs and she became egg bound. We don't know the cause. We think it was probably related to her being an Enigma in the first place. She passed one egg. It was very big, very hard. And then 2 weeks later, she passed another one. Her symptoms have never really quieted down since then. And then last year she ovulated again and laid one clutch of eggs that were not egg bound, so good for her, getting better. And then this year she's ovulating again. She's already lost weight in her tail, so I think she's going to be making eggs, which is just like, girl, why? But her symptoms have just gotten worse again, and instead of getting better each year, they get worse each year. And so I will eventually be faced with the hard decision of euthanasia if she continues to keep this up every year. So something to keep in mind is that ovulation is very stressful on a gecko's body, and so you will see that in your Enigma like way more than you'll see it in a regular abled gecko. I also want to mention that if you have a gecko that's an Enigma and it never displayed symptoms and then it ovulated or laid eggs and now it displays symptoms, that is quite common because a lot of times a stress incident is what makes Enigma syndrome like flare up. It kind of like awakens the syndrome in the gecko. So it can be a really bad shipping experience. It could be a physical injury. It could be poor health. It could be ovulation. It could be anything like that. And then your gecko will probably show symptoms forever. I think a big one is ovulation and breeding. That's a big one I think that awakens or worsens Enigma syndrome to the point that people notice it. One more thing I want to say about caring for Enigmas is that it does take a degree of, a huge amount of patience. You need to be able to be emotionally prepared for a gecko that is going to maybe rely on you for a lot of things, like needing assisted sheds. You need to Tong feed them. They're not going to be as independent as other geckos. You're not going to be able to give them as luxurious and enriching enclosures as other geckos. It's a stressful time. It really is, especially when they're going through like a poor health event or ovulation or something like that where their symptoms get worse. And then you just have to kind of see this gecko struggle, and it's really, really stressful, really painful. So I want to include that in caring for Enigmas, you also have to kind of care for yourself and realize that you have to be at 100% to give them your 100%. Does that make sense? You have to be in the right headspace to be able to give them the proper care, because like it can be a struggle to watch, you know, and I'm sure you've seen throughout this video how bad it can look. It can be a real struggle and it's a big task to take on, and I don't want anyone to do it with like, you know, over enthusiasm or with like a naive outlook. Like I want you to be prepared for the fact that Enigma syndrome can look like, you know, Marcella, where she pretty much can have a regular type of enclosure and just needs hand feeding. Or it can be like Gilly when she had a seizure when I was trying to get her stuck shut off when I first got her. You know, it can look like a lot of different things. You have to be prepared for all those different events. The one last thing I want to address, actually there's two more things, but one of them is that you need to offer proper care to your Enigmas, like above and beyond the type of like care you'd offer to a abled gecko. You need to make sure you have the right temperatures. You need to make sure you have a proper clean enclosure. You need to make sure that you are offering the proper supplements, the proper food. Like everything has to be ideal, you know, like you don't really have that much room for error, because if you mess up with an Enigma, it really will result in worse symptoms for them. So you just really have to be on top of your game. If you would like to check out my leopard gecko care video, it is like 2 hours long though, so make sure you grab a snack and like a notepad or something. But if you want to make sure that your husbandry is like, you know, good before you end up taking care of an Enigma, I'll leave that up here for you. The last thing I want to address is having an exotic vet. An exotic vet is a great resource for any gecko, abled or not, but with an Enigma, it's like an extra resource. Like it's extra important to have an exotic vet because, one, should the time come that their syndrome is so bad they need to be euthanized, that's the way to go. But also, they will be able to provide some resources that you may not have. So, for example, if you ever have an issue with your Enigma, like I did, for example, with Shireen. Shireen was having some issues with bloating in her abdomen as she wasn't pooping as normally as she should. And so I took her to the vet and they did an ultrasound and found that she had a tumor on her liver. She passed away shortly after. So, like, having a vet helps you to make sure your gecko's health is right where it needs to be, that way that their symptoms are less. It's really all about creating a healthy, safe environment and lifestyle for your gecko, like making sure you have the best husbandry, making sure that you keep everything stress-free, making sure you have a vet. That way your gecko can be in the best shape to be able to have Enigma syndrome and not have heightened symptoms. Okay. That is everything I had written down. I guess one more thing I should talk about is handling them. I don't recommend handling them like regularly. I really only handle my Enigmas to give them like a health check or to make sure everything's looking good, check if they're ovulating to see if they have any stuck shed. And it's very quick. You know, you don't want to hold them for too long. They can go catatonic or death roll or anything like that when you're holding them. So you really just want to be eyes on, not hands on with your Enigmas. But that's it. That's the video. I hope that you found this informational and insightful. Please let me know if you have any questions down below. I'll be sure to answer them. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, let me know by leaving a like, also a comment. Please subscribe and hit that notification bell. And with all that said, I will see you guys in the next one. Bye.